Welcome, everyone. You are listening to The Last Dinosaur, and I'm your host, Chris Aversano. This is the podcast where we explore the evolving maritime landscape and hear from the innovators leading that charge. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Mads Frank Markussen, Head of Research and FFA at Navi Merchants AS, part of the Copenhagen Merchants Group. Freight trading has been one of those areas that have always been targeted for digitalization and the improvements and efficiencies that go along with it. We'll talk about what Mads Frank has been doing at Navi Merchants and how CM Navigator plays a role in that transformation. Mads Frank, thank you. Thank you for coming on and welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm very thrilled to be here and I look forward to a great episode.
Absolutely. You know, I mean, if you go back to the beginning and the first tech bubble back in the early 2020s, freight trading part was the part that everybody glommed onto, tried to change immediately, and as hot and fast as it came in, it faded. Before we get into that, so that's why I'm really excited to talk to you today. Let's talk a little bit about your background and how you've gotten here, and more interestingly, about what, you know, the different companies within the Copenhagen Merchants Group are doing, because I think that that's where it's very interesting.
Yes, we are a conglomerate. Copenhagen Merchants Group consists of, I think, 60 different legal entities across 20 different countries. Most notably for what we are doing within, let's say, the maritime space, we have the ship owning part, Navi Merchants. We have the world's largest grain brokerage, Copenhagen Merchants. This is the original company. We have our digital company, the CM Navigator, where we build models for grain and freight markets. But we also own CM Terminals, which owns 8 or 9 ports and terminals throughout the Baltic. And then Schultz Shipping and Stevedoring, which is like a port agency in, I think, 15 different ports throughout the Baltic. We are also a minority owner in CM Biomass, which was spun off a few years ago, the world's largest biomass trader, which owns, let's say, more interesting for the American listeners, a terminal in the port of Savannah, shipping wood pellets to Europe, which these days looks like a bit of a difficult trade, but so far in the last 10 years, been good trade.
Oh, yeah. Well, we could talk about politics on a different podcast, but yeah, no, that's very interesting. All those different arms. And tell me a little bit about your evolution, because you've been kind of on the FFA side of the desk and kind of doing a lot of things. Really curious to hear about how you got to where you are today.
My background comes very much from good old school shipping. My dad used to be a chief engineer at a Maersk vessel, a tanker vessel. He sailed around Asia in the good old days. I also have an uncle who sailed around the world a few times. He claims to be one of the first persons sailing Coca-Cola into China on a container ship for Maersk. You know, with all seafarers, I don't know how much is true, but you get a certain, let's say, a taste of the culture and the heritage. Maersk is a very big company in Denmark, but I actually started my career in Norton as a trainee in the operations and chartering departments doing dry bulk. So I was very, let's say, traditional shipping man from Denmark, fixing ships, operating voyages, ordering bunkers, whatever you do as a very traditional ship owner or ship trader. My evolution comes in 3 steps. The next step was when I moved to Switzerland to work for Louis Dreyfus. I worked there as a freight trader. And the way you view things sitting in a grain house is very different than when you sit at a Danish operator or a Danish ship owner. You're much more financial. You look at things much more holistically, because does it really matter if you lose $4 on the freight if you can make $6 on the cargo? Yes, it does. But if you're a ship owner, you're not part of that equation in a way where it can make sense to leave money on the table for one part of the company. Third, let's say, leg in this evolution was when I came home from Dreyfus. I was part of a company. We made good money during the 2022 boom. Great fun. Traded everything. Everything from handy size to Cape size FFA during those days. It was a wild ride. After that, I was a bit saturated with the frontline trading. So I decided to pursue something new. And that's when I came into contact with Copenhagen Merchants. I knew them obviously from my Dreyfus days, and I know the guy who's the CEO of the Navi Merchants. But they had an ambition to start building models around their data and around what they do in real life. And I had been a part of that project in Louis Dreyfus, where they wanted to do the same. So it was fairly plug and play for me, obviously in a different context and so on. But I would say those 3 steps are my major career, let's say, milestones so far.
So when you look at modeling, and I think that this is really kind of the interesting part here, right? Because we're going to hear more and more about modeling, and whether it's on the front end of the trading side or even back end on, or I guess tangential on the emission side, or even modeling, let's say, to merge and other things, you could probably get into a lot of really interesting topics there. Talk about how the evolution of that, how maybe you're using some technology such as AI or MI, and how does modeling really start to look at things like we alluded to before, like tariffs? In other words, the black swan events, because I think that that's where you can use modeling for some of the more normal type trades. But when it gets to things getting a little outside of the normal, such as the Red Sea closure because of the Evergreen ship, and now the Red Sea closure, or at least partial closure for some folks because of the Houthi attacks. You look at COVID, you look at all these things that we really didn't, we would see in shipping, but spaced out. Now they're more on top of each other. That makes modeling a lot more difficult. I'd like you to walk through some of your thought process on that and some of your feelings about kind of how you're dealing with it.
Let me start another place. When I was a trainee in Norton, they realized, okay, let's focus on data. Let's focus on predictive modeling, but let's start within something where we can sort of control the variables. So they set up a fuel efficiency department. They hire a guy from, I think he came from Maersk, to say, hey, we don't see this anywhere in the market as a commercial software. Can you build us a model that can predict fuel consumption? Because we can see that going slow steaming could maybe make sense. We never tried slow steaming before, but it makes sense on the spreadsheet. But can you build us these models? So this guy ventured out, and he started collecting all the data in the world, 300 ships, every noon report, every weather report, etc. So he built a model. The guy is still there, so presumably it's a great success here, I think 14 years later. But I think this is a very good example of a use case everyone can understand. You optimize on speed versus hire versus fuel consumption. There is a P&L with that, and it's kind of easy to track. I think this is the, let's say, step one in the evolution of predictive modeling within dry bulk shipping. Now, there's a lot of these companies here in Copenhagen. I think there's 4 or 5. I don't know how different their models are. I think, to be honest, they can predict around 2-3 days out. And there are maybe a few difference in percentage points between the models. So obviously, if you're Norton, that makes a big difference. But for most people, I would argue, it's a solved problem, and you need to choose the one you like. Then we go to the next set of problems, which are a bit more opaque, but still somewhat predictable. Something like, when should I arrive in my vessel in whatever port to send a notice of readiness? Now, if you're discharging coal, it's shink, it's weather working, everything is fine, then it doesn't really matter that much. It's pretty easy to model. But let's say you are coming in with a vessel from the US, you have wheat on board, you're going to Algeria, Morocco, somewhere with notoriously low discharge rate, and in the winter time it can actually be quite rainy. So you don't really know, am I going to spend 20 days in port, or I'm going to spend 30 days, whereas 10 of them is just going to be time lost for weather. Now you can combine your fuel efficiency prediction model with perhaps a weather forecasting model, with perhaps a late time calculation model. So now you start building, let's say, model inside a model inside a model, which hopefully will make sure that when you have your 50 or 100 vessels and you have to time all of these notice of readiness better. Should I maybe also order overtime? You can always add, let's say, steps to this model in order to make better suggestions. However, what's very important about, let's say, the bigger the models you build, you need a lot of craftsman expertise as let's say, a shipping person. A weather routing model, I would argue a very skilled engineer or weather forecaster can sort of understand the complexities and build, let's say, something that works. But building something where you combine late time with overtime with fuel efficiency, you need to have worked at a ship owner. You need to understand these things in order to put it together, is at least my argument.
Yeah, I think that that's one of the things that, we've kind of seen and learned, is that when you're building models, and a lot of times, you get folks from outside the industry, which is great. I always believe that you got to have people who can bring a different approach. But I think the problem becomes, whether it's building this type of model or anything else, you need to have somebody or a few somebodies who can understand and interpret what the pain points are in order for the model to work correctly. Like, so if you have an engineer and she's been at your company forever and kind of maybe operations or engineering, got into operations and understands kind of what's going on, you can't ignore that person because she can bring a ton of not only experience, but then can really sniff out the crummy data or a bad output. You know, I think that's one of the more interesting things is to see what the output is, and does it not necessarily conform exactly what you think, but, you know, are you in the right area? Are you in the right ballpark, as they say here in the US? You know, okay, that makes sense. Or this is not what I expected. Why is it giving me this output? And, you know, it could be that somebody, you know, fat fingered a nude report, or it wasn't coded correctly or something. And then all of a sudden, you know, they put 38 degrees west and it's really 38 degrees east. And it gives you something that you don't expect because it's not what you thought. The machine learning or AI didn't pick that up. So I think there is a huge value in that.
And I can say that my, let's say, introduction to machine learning was that when all these noon reports came into Norton, I had to fact check them and make sure the masters didn't make any mistakes. And they did. So I probably every morning had to resend the 50 emails into the right format with the right values. But, you know, that's how you get going. That's how you start. Today, you can probably get algorithms to do it. But, you know, sometimes you got to do the tough work.
Yeah. I mean, new reports have been, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, new reports have been one of the, I think, biggest struggles, because if you look at things like what is speed, is it speed over ground? You know, if you're giving an ETA to a port, what are you basing it on? I'm basing it on the last 24 hours speed. Yeah, but I mean, remember my personal experience, the last 24 hours speed going from, let's say, Corpus Christi, getting us mostly across the Gulf, your next 24 hour speed is going to be very different because you're going to go north on the Gulf Stream and you're going to make, you know, instead of making turns for 13 knots, you're actually going to make 17 because you're going in the Gulf Stream. So what do you like? How are you going to be looking at that? And I think there's a lot of that interpretation on what you're trying to do. And there's a lot to be done there, even though it looks like it's a relatively simple task.
Yeah. And this sort of leads us also into the most difficult of models, the ones where you're trying to predict human behavior or markets, so to say. Because the cool thing about shipping, which is one of the, you know, magical features of trading this market, is there's actually a lot of human agency, which constantly changes back and forth. For example, the best example I can think of is if you're an owner and you're in Asia and you can either fix a trip out in Indonesia, you can ballast into South America. You can choose to ballast in full speed, you can ballast in slow steam. You can sail towards the Black Sea or to South America. Most likely South America these days, but you have options. So you can kind of adjust supply depending on how much is needed. Likewise, the charterers have multiple options. They can start taking period vessels. They can buy FFA. They can relet on voyage. They can buy a single trip. And depending on what is the mood, what is going on, it can really swing. I have a good example from this week. I was out eating with one of my friends who works as a Panamax head of something in a Panamax company. And once Trump wrote his tweet about the tariffs was paused, the Panamax bid offer curve from Santos to China jumped $2. Like, it makes no sense. I demand soybeans China to South America, China, but sentiment matters, and it matters.
Yeah, I remember trading.
You are in for a real treat.
Hey, I remember trading, you know, and just, you know, one of my colleagues used to say something like irrational exuberance, right, when the market was going up. Now he was one of his bigger accounts was one of the largest U.S. oil, not an oil major. I think they've technically called an independent, but big company, lots of refineries. So he was always, this is irrational exuberance. And sometimes it was, you know, sometimes the market would just jump because, let's say there was, you know, 3 cargoes on a Monday morning when everybody thought there'd only be 2. And all of a sudden, you know, the list looks a little bit tighter. And then there was that rumor of that other cargo. And then some traders are sniffing around. Now I'm talking on the tanker side. I'm sure it has its comparison to other ways. But I just, you know, I mean, there is a level of human touch psychology that will always be part of the market. And I know some where they're trying to get like these automatic freight trading systems are saying, let's get that out of there. But I always come back to, curious to hear your thought on this, are things like the brokers being involved in this and the freight trading platforms that are out there. People are like, oh, they're going to get rid of brokers. I always think that people are going to want brokers because there's a level of protection on a lot of things, whether it's operationally, whether it's things like, hey, we got to make sure that ship's not sanctioned. I want a separate set of eyes on this, and all these sort of things on the oil side, making sure that the ship is a good ship, that it has its sire and other type stuff, even though that's done within the process. You're a little bit of the ears and the eyes on the ground, but I'm really curious to hear your take on that with respect to like what you're hearing from some of the brokers, about as you're rolling things out and as you're using technology more and more.
I think it's a really big question with a few different angles. Keep in mind, we have the world's largest grain brokerage, so we are very much focused on what is the future of brokerage. And out of the 1,000 scenarios we can cook up in our head, more or less all of them have humans in it, because the thing that you're doing as a broker is helping your principal, whether it's a buyer or seller, make sense of the world and protect his or her interests. Now, no matter how many computers you put in between, you would still need someone who can assist you and help you. The difference between, say, grain brokerage and vessel brokers is that in shipping, historically, it's been the seller, i.e. the ship owner, who has paid the ship broker's commission. Therefore, their name ship broker. And the reason why they have been so valuable in shipping is because a ship can go to anywhere in the world. There are, let's say, 50 different geographical regions in the world if you are a handy-sized ship owner. But you cannot have 50 offices. I think even Norton have only 7 or 8 offices to cover the whole world. So if you are a Greek owner, you have maybe 5 handies, half in the east, half in the Atlantic, and then one on the west coast. You needed to work with people who would protect your interests. No matter how much AI you do, you're not going to work 24 hours a day if you're a Greek ship owner. You're not going to open 8 offices. So you're still going to need ship brokers to help you navigate this world. Now, freight buyers have for many years had it a bit easier because in general, they tend to be more geographically focused. Now, as the world is becoming smaller, consolidation, digitalization, financialization, more and more charters are getting bigger and bigger. I could imagine it's the same in oil. So more and more brokerages have also to become the global brokerages, but it's the same use case. So we see it in grain, we're seeing it in ship brokerage, that people are not sidestepping humans. Humans are still very much needed. And I don't know what you're hearing and seeing, but we are not seeing it here at least.
What I think there is, especially maybe about 8 to 10 years ago, there was another wave, the second bubble, so to speak. And I think, again, there was a lot of the brokerage community, especially folks who were around the first time around, like, oh, this is never going to work. This is never going to work. And then as some of the younger guys came in, I don't think they had that attitude. I think that they had more of an attitude of, we're going to have to live with this, and how can we use this to our advantage, right? Because the difference between a really successful shipbroker who can make a lot of money and somebody who's a little bit more moderate successful and someone who's washed out, I think all comes down to 2 things. 1, relationship, and 2, the information, right? So if you have a good relationship with somebody, even though you may not be the best, if you're like best buddies, you're always going to make money, and that always happens. It's not as sustainable, but it is a thing that's happened, and I've seen it happen. But I do think it's going to come down to adopting and adapting to what the principals are going to want, whether that is things like, hey, I want API feeds of fixtures. I want API feeds of voyages. I want to be connected to your system, or I want you to be connected to our system. So instead of making a phone call to tell me what my ETA is, you can, but I also want the ETA to come through an alert on my system. Whatever that system is, right? And I used to work for Vesson, so IMO system or something else. I want the alert to come through, or I want an update to come on my smartwatch about a market change. And I think that there are a lot of those sort of things. Again, it's going to be the human in the loop, because you're going to ultimately have to make that decision. I mean, negotiating clauses. I know there's a few companies out there that are trying to get that clause process in AI and things like that. Although I could see that ended up like some clause buried way down there getting changed, and all of a sudden it actually happens. And well, I didn't know that AI did it. That's going to be that'll happen in the next 5 years. But generally, what I think is I think the brokers that adapt and adopt to technology, and what it does is it actually may even the playing field with the smaller guys who may have a little bit of tech savvy or can work with an AI or outsource somebody for a short while to build a platform that can access other platforms. I think that's the way of the future. Those companies that adopt to that would be great. The other part too is the data that they collect. I've always argued it's 3 parts, right? Ship owners own ships, cargo owners own cargoes, brokers own data. And that was always like a second afterthought. But now that data is becoming more and more important, especially as you mentioned, you have a ship broker that only covers, let's say, West Coast of the US and Central America for handies. Yeah. Okay. They're not competing against with the big, getting the big commissions for doing iron ore into China or out of Brazil or whatever, but they have a niche and that data that they have is valuable because it's not ubiquitous.
I think it is a very good point. And I think also that markets have a tendency of adjusting yourself. If you're a Panamax broker out of South America, you're 1 out of 20 competing. If you're a West Coast broker, you're 1 out of 5. People need to live. People need to make a salary. There are, of course, these absolute sharks who can fix 7 days a week. However, from what I hear and the numbers I've been exposed to is that in let's say a large-scale ship brokerage, around 75% of all personnel is loss-making. 25% is actually pulling in the commission. So this monster Panamax broker out of South America, he needs 4 guys who calls everyone, feeds him, and then he connects the dots.
Yeah.
And
I think it's I'm going to just jump in here, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think the way that the curve was always explained to me, and this is on the tanker side, the first 3 years, you kind of don't make anything. You may lose a little money, but your job is to collect reports, collect position lists, help distribute those. If, somebody who's fixing a lot needs a hand in writing a recap, you do all that sort of grunt work, order pizza, whatever, because I did that for a while too. And then like year 3 to 5, 6, 7, you're break even or break even plus, right? So you should be covering your salary here in the US, your healthcare, whatever, right? So you should be, and then year 5 on, you should be making money to support, yourself and then others, right? And then that's always been kind of what was explained to me as the general curve. Now, some folks just come in and, again, it goes down to relationships. They got a buddy they went to school with, and here I'll give you, 1 Suezmax of cargo a month. And, you're kind of like already ahead of the curve. Or as other people like, here, kid, call these accounts that never pick up the phone to us and good luck. And, usually it's somewhere in the middle. But yeah, it's definitely right that you're probably right that you need a bunch of folks, 25-30% of that group is making the big money and everybody else is just kind of keeping the lights on. But you can't, if you lose them, then that 25% becomes either less efficient or they're working more and they'll burn out or make a mistake.
And this is, of course, speculating because I don't work in a ship brokerage, or some of this grunt work will be done by machines.
Absolutely.
And I think also it depends on what is the role of the ship broker and the relationship to the principal, as you alluded to before. I can give a practical example from my own days. When I sat in Northern Dreyfus, there was not a single broker which we believed had superior, let's say, market information, calculation, AI data. Some had bits and pieces we needed and we needed to call around. But ultimately, our mantra was we knew best. We knew what we wanted to buy. We knew what we wanted to sell. So the brokers we wanted to work with was not super tech-savvy data-driven. It was the exact opposite end. It was those people who are so amazing with other people that they can make unbelievable things happen in between other people. So when I myself work, let's say Black Sea, I work with a couple of Greek brokers. They didn't have much digital tech, but they knew everyone and their cousin, and they knew exactly how to get things done in a way where everyone was happy. This had a lot of value to us because, Dreyfus had terminals in the Black Sea back then. There was a whole program we needed to fix with these guys once a month. So we went to all the other end of the scale for certain purposes. Now, for other purposes, let's say South America, it was a bit more digital, tech savvy, maybe not exactly API in positions, but it was a bit of a different way you work with brokers because it's a different market. And I think, as you say, it will be even more different for tanker vessels or for chemical tankers or whatever it is, depending on what market you're trading.
Yeah, it's not going anywhere. It's just going to look different, which is what I tell people all the time. You did mention the Baltic a few times, and you guys kind of have your start there. And that's really your focus. You've mentioned that. Are you looking to expand out of that, or are you looking to kind of try to repeat this model in other areas, or are you very happy with the Baltic and just going to see how things played out, especially under the current geopolitical environment that we're in?
It's a bit of a funky question because before we sold most of the CM biomass to USTC or Bunker Holding, we had this port terminal in Savannah, 10 factories in the US, I think also lease of a terminal in Vietnam and something in South Korea. So it was like a global operation that's been sold off. So all the assets left are the Baltic ones. And this is mainly for historical reasons. ABCD companies, the Bunge, the Cargills, the Dreyfus, they did not invest in the Baltics in the, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, because it was communist. Nobody could do it. They invested in South America, in the US, in Australia, in Asia, even a bit in Africa, in the, let's say, the more stable parts. So once Baltic opened up and CM Group or Copenhagen Merchants was already present in Denmark, Germany, Sweden, it was quite, let's say, easy to jump into the other places. Now, the thing that Copenhagen Merchants do, which I think is a cool thing because it creates a different kind of thinking, is we do a lot of joint ventures. So some of the terminals are owned with Viterra, some of the terminals are owned with Bunge, some of the terminals are owned with outside investors, because we'd rather have 10 terminals and own 51% than have 5 terminals we own 100%, because it mitigates some risk. We are more in the trades. We can have benefits of scale. We have offices in Brazil, we have offices in Dubai, we have, let's say, satellite offices, partners in the US and Asia. So we are sort of global, but not in the same way that, let's say, a Cargill or Bunge is. But we are getting there because grain shipping is a global market. And what the price is for wheat out of Poland is sometimes defined with what are people willing to pay in Indonesia. So you need to be close to your Indonesian buyers, and you need to know what is the freight rate.
And that makes all the sense in the world as you start to build out, and as you explained earlier. We go back to the beginning, and you're in a part of a bigger group, and we've seen this in other ones, especially in Denmark. You have Njord and Maersk Tankers. You have the Signal Group out of Greece, and they kind of have a technology bend to it. Talk about a little bit of the challenges and the advantages of, building a platform, and then talk a little bit about the platform you're trying to build out and working, in an environment that has, let's say, physical assets and how they come together, because this is something that we talked a little bit before we got going. This is something that's happening all over the place and happening more.
So 5 or 6 years ago, the owner realized that we're sitting on a lot of data, but it's difficult to connect. It's difficult to put together because the way we were communicating was purely through WhatsApp. So we had, 30 grain brokers worldwide who communicated all the bids and offers via WhatsApp. Whereas in shipbroking, you can maybe say, okay, I do handy-sized continents, so we have a group for that. In grain, everything is global. So it was one big mess, 1,000 messages a day. So he, together with, let's say, the head of Geneva office, decided, let's build a platform. Let's make it simple. It's going to be Excel, Power BI, very prototype-ish, but let's get it going. So this guy in Geneva, who was, despite being 60 years old, he was quite tech-savvy and a bit of a workaholic. I think he went to his summer house for a week and he built by himself a working prototype. And it worked. It kind of, let's say, proved the business case that, hey, there's a better way to communicate internally. Then there came the second step. He was like, well, I would also like to see what is the supply demand. What are the vessels on water? What are the lineups? What are all these things that a good grain broker would need to serve some of his customers? So he started building that, and that was actually quite good traction. I think, and now I'm not 100% sure on this number, but it was something like 25 of our group customers who decided to use this platform because it was better than what they had internally, which is okay, validated, but it had its limitation. Excel, Power BI, you're sort of limited with how much can you scale, how fast, these kind of things.
Right.
So the owner decided to spin it out and invest some real money in it, hire software engineers, build it properly. And this is sort of where I come into the equation, because large part of connecting bids and offers in the grain world is having the freight. Because everyone in Spain who buys wheat for their mill or corn for their porks, they sit and do net back calculations and say, should I buy from the US? Should I buy from Romania? Should I buy from Brazil? What do I do? What is the puzzle here? What are the pieces I'm working with? There are some spreadsheets existing internally in the big, let's say, grain houses. I helped build one in LDC where we did, let's say, 5,000 routes or maybe 10,000 routes for, let's say, a few selected traders to get the concept going. And the owner here at Copenhagen Merchants was like, I don't want 5,000, I want 500,000. And we're like, okay, theoretically it should be possible, but so me and another guy who was a software engineer, we probably spend a few hours a day for half a year scoping this thing. Like, how do you put this together computationally? Because the logic for calculating a freight rate is the same for one rate or for 500,000. But putting all the pieces together and having it run, let's say, every half hour is another hurdle. In the end, we managed. We made it happen. I think we ended up having something like 60 different data tables with shipping data and more than, I think, 5,000 lines of code. But we made it happen. So he was very happy because now for any given trade, we can connect what are the freight rate from Klaipeda to all 500 ports in the world where people buy wheat. So this is sort of where, let's say, where we started. Then we said, okay, now let's connect it to all the grain prices. So if we have, let's say, 10,000 grain prices times 500,000 freight rates, it gets into the millions. And suddenly we can start putting together puzzles together with, let's say, trade flows data or lineups data. And now suddenly the customer is like, okay, this is something we really like. So we decided to make it payable. The customers would have to pay for it because it's, after all, cost a fair bit of money to build these things. But so far it's been a good success. We have, I think, 80 customers on board. And I think out of the 50 largest grain trading or grain companies in the world, I think something like 90% are customers. Now it's just about scaling it, making it better, making it better. So it's been quite the journey so far because we are venturing a bit into the unknown. We haven't found anyone where we can look and say, hey, let's copy their homework. Let's just do like Amazon did, because it's not the same business case.
No, it's really interesting. And it kind of leads me to another question that I love to ask is, when you look back and you're talking to somebody you're going to hire at any one of the groups, who's new to the industry, let's say, and has a good opportunity to go work someplace else. I know you're in Denmark, so let's just, if it's not Maersk, maybe it's Lego. So let's say they want to go work at Lego and you're like, no, come work. I joke around with people, come to the dark side. We have cookies, so come to shipping. What do you tell people about shipping who may not have, knowledge? Now, it's different in Denmark because Maersk is such a big employer and you're a lot more exposed to, let's say, than people here in the US or other places. But how do you kind of explain your job and how you're excited about it and what it means in the future? Forget about today, but what's the next 5-10 years hold for somebody joining our industry?
I think what makes Denmark so amazing, or let's say Danish shipping so amazing, is the high level of freedom. You're basically allowed to travel anywhere, try anything. You can set up your own company online in 2 minutes. So a lot of entrepreneurial people who are not necessarily dreaming of going 5 years to university, they seek towards shipping. Shipping is also a bit of, let's say, a prestige career. In Switzerland, it's commodities. In the US, it's maybe working for a hedge fund. But in Denmark, it's shipping. So you have a lot of, let's say, talent looking to prove something coming into shipping. I think Maersk, they had a really good model, let's say 30, 40 years ago, where you spend 2 years at headquarters and then you were sent 4 years to Indonesia, Malaysia. You had sort of a budget and they were like, go make the most of this. And because they had maybe 100 of these people every year, they had a quite large talent pool. So the ones who rises to the top were extremely gifted business people who had seen many things in this life. little bit of this model still exists. I have a lot of friends and colleagues who, for example, with Northern, went abroad. They spent maybe 3 years in Singapore and 2 years in China before coming back. So in Denmark, more or less everyone doing shipping has spent time abroad and has this entrepreneurial go-get-them spirit. I think Lego is amazing for many purposes, but I think it's a bit different. It's a very, let's say, mature company. Maersk is also today is a very mature company. You almost need like a PhD in software to come work on the new problems. But let's say dry bulk shipping, tanker shipping, super entrepreneurial. Just look at, let's say, Hafnia, what they achieved in 10 years.
It's pretty amazing, and I look at Denmark as definitely as a beacon in our industry for that. Singapore certainly, and you're seeing other places, Hamburg and Israel as well, which is more on the entrepreneurial side, investing and things like that. And I had some really serious conversations recently with folks about, can the U.S. capture some of that with what's going on politically? One interesting thing is there's going to be, at least on paper, a lot of interest in shipbuilding and shipping on the U.S. side. So maybe there's some avenues for entrepreneur spirit here in the U.S. as well. As we wrapped up, I love asking this question, got a lot on the hop, doing a lot of things. So, what is the latest book or article or something that kind of came across your desk that you really kind of are reading or really shaped your thinking recently?
I have 2 books that comes to mind. The first one is called The Man Who Sold the Market, and it's about a guy named Jimmy Simmons who started a hedge fund called Renaissance Technologies. He used to work for the CIA or something in the 60s, became a math professor, and then when he was 40, he said, you know what? I can beat these guys. And he actually set out and did it. And for, I think, 35 years, they achieved an annual return of 30%. And what I like most about that story is not the hedge fund America big money, but how it was so practical when he started. He was like, we need to trade commodities. You over in the corner, take your car, drive to Chicago, go to the basement, and take the last 50 years of ticker recordings on soybean futures. You go to Kansas, you record this. So the first 5 years, they spent assembling all kind of weird niche data before anything called API or spreadsheet even existed. And it's quite an amazing story about incremental entrepreneurship, how it starts small and how it builds. Not to say Copenhagen Merchants Group is in the same league, but it started in a basement, one man, then he had another man, then they started renting some terminal capacity, then they started investing a bit in a ship, So just add, one acquisition per year and suddenly you have quite a big company. So this I can really enjoy as, let's say, a vacation read. It's quite entertaining, well written. So that's my first book I can recommend. The second one is, let's say, one that's important for the times. It's by another hedge fund manager called Ray Dalio, very famous in the USA, or maybe infamous, I should say. He has, at least from what I can read, a very special approach to how he runs his company. I don't know, I never worked there, but his book on geopolitics, the world orders, and a history of how has economic history been from, let's say, an investment currency portfolio point of view, are super well written, super interesting, and also something that these days, when you're seeing the break-off of this Pax Americana, NATO maybe not working more, the USA isolating a bit itself, trying to corner China, and there's so many thoughts in his book which become relevant because he also spent a very large amount of time in China and has also become quite rich in the last 30 years of knowing what is going on in China. So these are the 2 books I can recommend. I think it's called The Changing World Order or something like that. He's written multiple, and they're all.
Yeah, he's really good. He's been weighing in a lot on the recent political turmoil, and I guess with what you're saying, given his background and kind of his expertise, makes a lot of sense. Well, Mads Frank, this was fantastic. Thank you for sharing your journey and kind of what you're doing and a little bit your thoughts about everything from how a grain trader should approach things and how things have changed to what your view is on, the brokers in the world as well. Not just ship brokers, but all brokers. It's never going to go away. It's just going to look a little different. And I love hearing what the companies with an S at the end are doing and kind of taking a digital direction. So thank you for coming on the pod. Much appreciated.
Yeah, thank you for having me. It was a real pleasure, and I learned a thing or two, which is always worth something.
Yeah, you always got to learn a thing or two. Thanks for coming on. Appreciate it.